This was never supposed to happen. She was just living her life, quiet, gentle, curious. But one mistake, one moment of misunderstanding, and suddenly, everyone wanted her dead. In a small village bordering the edge of the last great rainforest, fear turned into fury. They said the gorilla was dangerous, that she was cursed, that she had to be stopped before someone else got hurt. They formed hunting parties, tracked her for miles, set traps. The forest that once protected her became a death trap. The clock was ticking. Then, she stepped in. One woman, one voice. Against the crowd, the bullets, the fear. And what she did, what she risked, would change everything. This is the story of Malaika, and the woman who saved her. Malaika wasn't always feared. She was born in the heart of the rainforest, raised by a mother who taught her the ways of the wild. Her life began like any other gorilla's, peaceful, unmarked by human hands. But that changed when poachers found her family. They killed her mother and left her to die. She was barely an infant, weak and alone. A rescue team found her just in time. They took her to a sanctuary, a place where she could heal. The next few years were spent in a protected environment, surrounded by other orphaned animals, all of them struggling to adapt to a life that was no longer their own. But Malaika, despite her tragic start, grew strong. She learned to trust again. And when she was old enough, it was time for the final step, to reintroduce her to the wild. For months, they worked on the plan. Malaika's reintroduction was carefully monitored, as they wanted to ensure she could survive in the dense jungle again. When the time came, she was released. The forest, her birthplace, was now her home once more. For the first year, it seemed like Malaika had found her place. She roamed the forest, a quiet force of nature, rarely seen but always present. She avoided human contact, sticking to the deeper parts of the jungle. But over time, the villagers began to take notice. At first, it was curiosity. They'd seen her tracks, heard whispers of the gorilla that roamed the trees. But that curiosity turned to fear. As the stories spread, so did the rumors. Some said she was a danger to the village. Others believed her to be a bad omen, sent to punish them for something they didn't understand. Malaika, in their eyes, became something monstrous. The very creature they once respected now turned into a threat they couldn't control. Then came the incident. It happened on a hot afternoon when the village was bustling with activity. A young boy, no older than 7, wandered too close to the edge of the jungle. He had been playing with his friends, chasing a ball, when it bounced into the dense undergrowth. The child, eager to retrieve it, ventured further than he should have. What happened next would be remembered for years. Malaika, who had been nearby, saw the boy. She wasn't aggressive, she wasn't attacking. But the boy, frightened by the large creature, screamed. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a shock of panic through him. In an instinctual reaction, he ran. And that's when the villagers heard it. The boy's cry and the sounds of something crashing through the jungle. The boy made it back to the village, shaken but unharmed. He'd tripped, but Malaika had never come close enough to hurt him. But the damage was done. By the time he returned, the story was already twisting through the air, amplified by fear. The boy spoke of the gorilla's eyes, how they glowed with menace, how her growl seemed to shake the earth itself. The rumors spread like wildfire. What had been a misunderstanding, an innocent encounter, was now seen as a sign of something far worse. The villagers gathered in the square, their voices rising in anger and fear. Some were demanding action, others suggesting that the gorilla be killed for the safety of everyone. The community was divided. Those who had once spoken of respecting the jungle and its creatures now called for blood. It wasn't long before a plan was set in motion. Armed men were dispatched. They would track Malaika down and make sure she never posed a threat again. The sanctuary's caretakers pleaded for calm, but their voices were drowned out by the sound of rifles being loaded. It was no longer just a gorilla in the jungle. She had become a symbol of danger, of the unknown, and for some, that was something that had to be eradicated. The hunt began in earnest. The clock was ticking. Time was running out for Malaika. Dr. Amina Mwangi had spent years studying primates, but her bond with Malaika was different. Amina had seen the gorilla grow from an infant struggling to survive into a confident adult, learning the ways of the wild. She knew Malaika was not a threat, but the villagers didn't. Amina understood that the gorilla's actions had been misunderstood, that the fear was rooted in ignorance, not malice. But no one was listening to her. They only heard the calls for vengeance. When Amina first heard about the incident, she was thousands of miles away, working in another part of the country. But the news reached her quickly. She couldn't sit back and let a life she'd helped protect be taken. She packed her things and made the long journey back to the village, her heart heavy with dread. By the time she arrived, the situation was already escalating. The hunting parties were already out, and the fear in the village was palpable. Amina knew she had to act, not just for Malaika, but for the community that didn't yet understand the truth. When she arrived in the village, she was met with suspicion. The villagers weren't sure who she was or why she had come back. They had heard of her before, but now she wasn't a scientist coming to help. She was an outsider, an advocate for the very creature they were hunting. The tension was thick in the air, but Amina remained calm. She made her way through the village to the council, where the decision was being made to send the men out again. With her knowledge of the gorilla and her deep connection to the rainforest, Amina pleaded with the elders. She spoke not just of science, but of empathy. She reminded them that the forest was not just a place of danger, but one of balance, that Malaika had been a part of it long before any of them had built homes here, and that, despite what had happened with the boy, Malaika wasn't a monster. She was a creature of the wild, responding out of fear, just like the villagers. But the elders were firm. They were afraid. And Amina knew that the only way to stop the hunt was to go directly to the jungle, to find Malaika herself, and bring her back safely. She had to convince the villagers that their fear was misplaced before it was too late. With a heavy heart, Amina set out on foot into the thick jungle, determined to find Malaika before the hunters did. Amina knew the risks. The forest was vast and the hunting parties were closing in, but she had to try. She walked into the jungle alone, the sounds of the village fading behind her, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. The path ahead was uncertain, and with every step, the weight of the situation grew heavier. Time was running out, and she didn't know how much longer Malaika would stay hidden. For hours, Amina tracked the faint signs of the gorilla, broken branches, deep footprints in the mud. She called out softly, hoping the sound of her voice would reach the animal. She didn't want to scare her, but she needed to make contact before the hunters did. The forest felt oppressive now, a living entity that seemed to watch her every move. But still, Amina pressed on, determined to find the gorilla she knew so well. As the day wore on, the heat and humidity began to take their toll. Amina was exhausted, but she refused to stop. She knew the villagers were close, and they wouldn't hesitate to shoot. She couldn't let that happen. Then, just as she began to lose hope, she spotted a movement in the distance, a shadow darting between the trees. It was Malaika. Amina's heart raced as she carefully approached, her voice barely a whisper. She called the gorilla's name, softly at first, then louder as she stepped closer. Malaika paused, her dark eyes locking onto Amina's. There was a moment of stillness, a pause where neither of them moved. Amina could see the tension in Malaika's body, but she could also see the recognition in her gaze. This wasn't a creature of rage. This was a creature of survival, just like the villagers. Amina took a deep breath, slowly extending her hand toward the gorilla, as if asking for trust. The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, carefully, Malaika stepped forward. Amina knew this was her chance. She had to bridge the gap between fear and understanding, between the people who wanted her dead and the animal who had done nothing wrong. The silence was broken by the distant sound of footsteps, hunters, coming closer. Amina had no time to waste. She moved quickly but gently, standing between the gorilla and the approaching danger. She knew that if the hunters saw her, they would shoot. She had to make them see Malaika for what she truly was, not a monster, but a victim of fear, just like everyone else. With one last glance at the gorilla, Amina turned toward the hunters and stood her ground. There was no turning back now. The moment was electric with tension, a fragile standoff between fear and reason. The hunters paused when they saw Amina standing in front of Malaika, her arms slightly raised in a gesture of calm. The guns were still, but the air felt charged, as if any wrong move could ignite the situation into chaos. Amina held their gaze, unwavering, her voice steady but firm. She spoke not to the hunters, but to the village, to the heart of the fear that had taken root in their minds. She reminded them of the bigger picture, the shared history of the land and the creatures who lived in it. She spoke of balance, of the interconnectedness between the people and the jungle. Amina didn't just ask them to stop hunting the gorilla, she pleaded for understanding. She asked them to remember that the forest and its inhabitants were not enemies, but partners in survival. The hunters, some of them young men with shaky hands, looked at each other uncertainly. The tension hung thick in the air, but Amina's words began to break through the fear. She knew this wasn't just about one gorilla. It was about the future of the community, about the possibility of coexistence between humans and nature, and she wasn't going to let it end in violence. It wasn't immediate. There were murmurs, doubts, questions. Some villagers were still scared, still angry, but Amina's presence, her conviction, slowly began to shift the mood. The reality of the situation, that killing Malaika would not solve anything, started to sink in. A few of the hunters lowered their rifles, and one by one, they started to put the guns down, stepping back from the brink. They didn't understand her plea fully, but they could feel her sincerity. They could see the calm in her eyes, and for a moment, they chose to listen. Amina turned back to Malaika, slowly stepping aside. The gorilla, who had been watching intently, took a cautious step forward, then another. Amina motioned for the villagers to give her space, to allow Malaika to leave, to retreat back into the jungle where she belonged. The realization that they had the power to protect, rather than destroy, took root. The hunters, though reluctant, stepped back, realizing that the true danger wasn't the gorilla, but the unchecked fear that had led them here. The air shifted from tension to something else, something more like peace. Slowly, the village began to understand the message Amina had brought, that respect for the wild was more powerful than fear of the unknown. That day, Malaika was spared. She turned, her massive form disappearing into the trees, leaving behind a sense of relief, but also a deep reflection on what had just transpired. It wasn't just the gorilla that had been saved. It was a chance for the village to change, to evolve. And for Amina, it was a small victory in the larger fight for wildlife and the preservation of nature's delicate balance. Malaika's survival marked more than just the end of a hunt. It was the beginning of something new for the village. Slowly, things began to change. The fear that once gripped the hearts of the villagers started to loosen, replaced by something else: understanding. Amina's efforts, her willingness to stand between the villagers and the gorilla, had sparked a conversation that needed to happen. It was no longer just about protecting one animal. It was about finding a way to coexist with the wild. The villagers, over time, began to recognize the importance of preserving their natural surroundings. What had once been a place of fear was now seen through a new lens, as a resource, a sanctuary, a vital part of their lives. The jungle wasn't something to be conquered or feared. It was a partner, a living force that they depended on. Malaika's presence in the forest became a symbol of this newfound respect. She wasn't just a gorilla. She was a reminder of the delicate balance they all shared with nature. Amina returned to the village frequently, not just to check on Malika, but to continue her work of educating the people. She set up workshops, talked to the children, and helped them understand the importance of wildlife conservation. The villagers, especially the younger generation, started to see the jungle not as a threat, but as a source of wonder and life. They learned to appreciate the beauty and complexity of the ecosystem around them. As the years passed, the village became a beacon of hope for other communities. The villagers had learned that fear could be overcome, that understanding could replace violence, and that coexistence was possible. They built a protective zone around the forest, ensuring that both the animals and the people could thrive. And Malika, who had once been a symbol of danger, became a symbol of change. Today, Malika lives freely in the jungle, raising her young in the same forest where she was once almost lost. She's a rare symbol of resilience and the bond between humans and wildlife. The village that once feared her now protects her, and the story of how one woman stepped in to save a gorilla is remembered as the catalyst for a movement that transcended fear. For Amina, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a moment that reminded her why she became a conservationist in the first place. It wasn't just about saving individual animals. It was about saving a way of life, one that honored the natural world. And as she watched Malika and her family disappear into the trees, Amina knew that the future, though uncertain, was a little brighter for both humans and wildlife.